In August 2018, the disappearance of 34-year-old Shanann Watts and her two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, shocked a small suburb of Frederick, Colorado. Shanann, known for her active lifestyle and dedication to her family, was 5 months pregnant and expecting her third child. She and her husband, Chris Watts, seemed like the perfect couple. Photos of their happy family regularly appeared on social media. The woman had a Facebook blog. The topic of the blog was motherhood and married life. Shanann talked about how they met Chris like this: "I wasn't looking for guys, but he suddenly asked to be friends. I decided to go and meet him. He was one of the millions of people on Facebook. At first I pushed Chris away, coming up with excuses every day. He went to my colonoscopy. I tortured him. I rejected him. But he didn't run away. He stayed because he was the one." She often shared with her followers how happy she is in her marriage, how she loves her children. She also shared that she is expecting a third baby. Perhaps it will be a long-awaited boy, or maybe a beautiful princess again. Life was in full swing: daily care of children, a happy marriage, business, own house. In general, 34-year-old Shanann dreamed only of this. However, there were problems behind the facade of well-being. The family was in serious financial difficulties, and the relationship between Shanann and Chris became increasingly strained. When Shanann and her daughters suddenly disappeared, Chris claimed to know nothing about their whereabouts. The search began immediately, attracting the attention not only of local residents, but also of the entire country, gradually turning into one of the most shocking family tragedies in modern America.
This is the last video of Shanann returning home from a business trip.
On the morning of August 13, 2018, Shanann Watts and her daughters Bella and Celeste disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Shanann returned home late at night after a business trip and meeting with a friend, and that was the last thing anyone knew about her. The next day, her friend Nicole Atkinson began to worry when Shanann did not respond to messages and did not get in touch. Nicole knew that Shanann was a punctual and responsible person, especially considering her job and pregnancy. Nicole decided to go to the Watts house to check if everything was okay. When she arrived and couldn't reach Shanann, she immediately felt that something was wrong.
Yeah. She was dropped off by her friend Nicole Atkinson in the white car, who the next day reported her missing to police.
Nicole noticed that Shanann's car was still in the garage, and the house looked empty and quiet. Considering that Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant, Nicole assumed that she might have felt unwell or needed help. Nicole rang the doorbell, but no one answered. Becoming increasingly anxious, she contacted Chris Watts, who was working that day. Chris seemed calm on the phone and assured her that everything was fine, and Shanann and the kids probably just left the house. However, Nicole was not satisfied with his answer, and she insisted that he return home as soon as possible. After that, Nicole contacted the police and reported the disappearance of her friend and her daughters. When the police arrived at the scene, Chris had already returned home. His behavior seemed strange to both Nicole and the officers. Chris claimed that he had talked to Shanann before work that morning, but he had no idea where she might have gone. He allowed the police to enter the house and conduct an inspection. The house looked tidy, no signs of forced entry or struggle were seen. However, the presence of Shanann's personal belongings, such as wallet, phone and keys, alerted the police. Patrolman Nicholas Matthews, one of the first officers on the scene, immediately sensed that something was wrong. "This is not an ordinary disappearance," he commented later in his report. "The house was too clean, too tidy. It felt like someone was cleaning up here or trying to erase the tracks." Chris claimed that he did not know where his wife could have gone and assumed that she could have gone to friends or with the children for a walk. However, the police decided to continue the investigation. The officers asked Chris about the last few days and the events that could lead to such a disappearance. There was nothing suspicious in his answers, but the lack of obvious concern made the detectives think. Soon, human search specialists were involved. Officers began checking nearby neighborhoods, interviewing neighbors, and looking for possible clues to the whereabouts of Shanann and her children. Additional examinations were carried out at the Watts house to find traces of blood, struggle, or other signs of violent acts. Detectives began interviewing neighbors and acquaintances of the Watts family. Most of them claimed that they had never noticed any problems in this family. However, some have mentioned that Chris has become more withdrawn and detached lately. As the investigation continued, detectives were paying more and more attention to Chris Watts' behavior. He actively participated in the search, communicated with the police and the media, and asked the public for help in finding his family. However, his indifference and cold tone in the interview aroused suspicion among detectives. The officers began to note that his behavior did not correspond to the reaction of a man whose wife and children had disappeared. The disappearance of Shanann and her daughters continued to remain a mystery as detectives began to closely examine Chris Watts' behavior. In the first days after his disappearance, Chris seemed confused. He gave several interviews to local news channels, begging for the return of his wife and children. When detectives began to inspect the Watts house, they noticed several strange details. There were no signs of a struggle in the house. There were no signs of forced entry or destruction. However, during a more thorough examination, several disturbing clues were found. The police drew attention to the presence of Shanann's personal belongings, such as her mobile phone, medicines, wallet, and keys, which were found in the house, indicating that she could not just leave voluntarily. In addition, Shanann's friends told the police that she never left her belongings at home, especially when she went out with the children. This suggested that her disappearance was not accidental. Detectives also examined the CCTV footage. One of the neighbors, Nate Trainey, provided police with footage from his surveillance camera, which was pointed at the street in front of his house. The footage showed Chris's car leaving the garage early on the morning of the disappearance. He was loading something into his truck and then returned a few hours later. Chris's car was parked not in the usual place in front of the house, but near the garage, and it was not visible what exactly he was loading into his car. From that moment on, it was only a matter of time for the detectives to solve this case.
There was a little bit of an argument. It went away. They supposedly were intimate.
The police called Chris Watts for the first formal interrogation. He looked worried but tried to stay calm and cooperate. During the interrogation, Chris claimed that the night before he disappeared, he and Shanann talked about divorce, which led to an emotional quarrel. He claimed that after this quarrel, Shanann went to bed, and the next morning she was gone. "We had a fight, but I never thought she could leave," he said, avoiding the detective's gaze. However, as the interrogation continued, his testimony became more and more confused and contradictory. Detectives noticed that he could not remember exactly what he and Shanann had talked about that night, and his testimony did not match the testimony of witnesses and friends with whom Shanann had communicated shortly before the disappearance. In addition, detectives began using a polygraph to assess the veracity of his answers. The polygraph showed a significant deviation indicating a lie when Chris answered questions related to the disappearance of his wife and children. These results marked a turning point in the investigation. The detectives knew that they had good reasons to put further pressure on Chris to find out the truth. "Chris, the polygraph results show that you're not telling us the whole truth," said the detective sitting across from him. "If you want to help to find your wife and children, you need to be honest." Chris tensed, his face turned pale, but he continued to claim that he had nothing to do with their disappearance. The police decided to increase the pressure on Chris by asking him more pointed questions about his relationship with Shanann and about his movements on the day she disappeared. With each new question, his answers became more and more confused. Detectives drew attention to his behavior in the morning hours after his disappearance, pointing out that he never tried to call or text Shanann, despite her absence. "Why didn't you call her?" one of the detectives asked. "If my wife and children were missing, I would call them incessantly." Chris was silent for a few seconds, then answered, "I thought she just went to her friends. I didn't want to bother her after the fight." Detectives also drew attention to his strange behavior in the videos. Chris claimed that he loaded tools into the car for work but could not explain why he did it so early in the morning. "You were loading something heavy into your car," Chris the detective said. "What was that?" Chris continued to insist that these were just tools, but his nervousness and attempts to avoid direct answers only increased the suspicions of the police. The detectives realized that they were close to uncovering the truth. Realizing that Chris was hiding something, they decided to conduct another stage of the investigation, a search of nearby territories and interviews with neighbors to find any possible clues that could shed light on the events that occurred on the day Shanann and her children disappeared. Further testimony from neighbors pointed to Chris' uncharacteristic behavior in the days leading up to the disappearance. One of them noticed that Chris had become more withdrawn and tense in recent weeks, and often spent time outside talking on the phone with someone. Police also examined data from Shanann's mobile phone, discovering that her last conversation was with her friend Nicole Atkinson, who was also one of the first to express concern about her disappearance. Nicole said that Shanann had returned from a business trip the night before, and they talked late into the night. Shanann complained that Chris was acting distant and cold, and was concerned about their relationship.
Her saying that, she knows he was cheating on her, to the effect of he would never see his kids again.
Investigators began to carefully analyze the phone records and location data of Chris' mobile phone. It turned out that during those night hours when Shanann and the children disappeared, Chris was actively texting with someone. As a result of the investigation, it turned out that he had a romantic affair on the side with a woman named Nicole Kessinger, whom he met at work. It became obvious from the phone records that their relationship was developing rapidly, and Chris often talked to Nicole about his family problems. In one of the messages, he mentioned that his marriage to Shanann had come to an end, and that he would like to start a new life with Nicole. These revelations became a serious motive for the police, confirming their theory that Chris could have been motivated by getting rid of his wife and children for a new life. In addition, Chris's financial transactions were analyzed. It turned out that the Watts family had serious financial problems. They were in arrears on their mortgage, and their credit cards were almost at their maximum. Despite this, a few days before Shanann disappeared, Chris withdrew a large amount of cash, as if he was preparing for some kind of plan. Detectives have decided to begin formal interrogations of Nicole Kessinger. Nicole initially denied knowing anything about the disappearance of Shanann and the children, but later admitted that Chris had told her about plans for the future, which included divorce and relocation. She assured the police that she did not know about his intentions until she learned about the disappearance of his family. "I never thought he was capable of such a thing," Nicole declared, her voice trembling. "He seemed caring and kind. He said he just wanted to be happy and free." These words became another piece of circumstantial evidence against Chris. Under the pressure of evidence and contradictory testimony, Chris Watts increasingly felt the tension surrounding him on all sides. The detectives decided it was time to make one last attempt to get the truth out of him. They invited Chris for another interrogation in the hope that this time he would be more open. Detectives Luke Uphoff and Leanne Bethune prepared for the interrogation carefully, thinking over every word to make Chris feel uncomfortable. They understood that pressure could be a decisive factor in trying to bring him to the surface. Working with them was FBI agent Graham Cadges, who specialized in interrogation psychology and knew how to put pressure on a suspect. When Chris sat down at the table, the detectives began with soft questions, gradually moving on to more difficult ones. Chris became increasingly nervous and tried to avoid direct answers, but the detectives continued to insist. Agent Cadges, watching Chris's reaction, realized that it was time to move on to more aggressive tactics. "Chris," he began, leaning on the table, "all the evidence points to you. We need to know what really happened. If you don't tell us, we'll find out for ourselves. But you have to understand that every day of silence makes your situation worse." Chris stared at the table, avoiding direct gaze, his hands trembling slightly. Realizing that he was at an impasse, he finally spoke. "I do not know what else to say. I didn't do it." "Chris, you can't keep lying," Cadges insisted. "We know what you did. We know it was you who killed Shanann and the girls. The only question now is why. Why did you do that?" Chris was silent for a long time, breathing heavily. Finally, he looked up, and there was a mixture of despair and fatigue in his gaze. I didn't want it to end like this," he said softly, barely audible. I didn't know what to do. I was under pressure, and I wasn't thinking clearly." Agent Cadges and the detectives understood that Chris was ready to confess and gave him time. They invited Chris's father to make him feel remorse. Finally, he began to talk. He confessed that he strangled Shanann that night after she discovered his infidelity and threatened to take the children and leave him. She was furious, he recalled, his eyes filling with tears. "I didn't think I could calm her down. I felt trapped."
As a consequence of that conversation, he strangled her to death.
Then he confessed that, realizing that he had killed his wife, he strangled his daughters in turn. First, Celeste, who came into the room and saw the lifeless body of her pregnant mother. Then Bella, who shouted for the last time, "Dad, no. You are welcome." "I didn't know what to do," he said, his voice almost soundless. "I didn't want them to suffer without their mother. I just wanted it to stop."
I try to go back in my head, I'm just like, I didn't want to do this, but I did it.
The detectives were shocked by the frankness of his confession. Chris said that after the murder, he loaded the bodies of his wife and children into his truck and took them to the oil field where he worked. He confessed that he hid the bodies of his daughters in oil tanks and buried Shanann's body nearby. "I just wasn't thinking clearly," he repeated over and over, his face pale and devoid of emotion. "I didn't want this, but it got out of hand." After Chris Watts' confession, the police immediately went to the oil field to find the bodies of Shanann and her children. Upon arrival, they found the bodies of Bella and Celeste in 2 different oil tanks, which confirmed Chris' words. Shanann's body was found near the reservoirs, buried in a shallow grave. These findings shocked even the most experienced detectives. They realized how monstrous the crime was, and how Chris was trying to hide his tracks. They also realized that the investigation had come to an end. The perpetrator had been found, and he confessed to what he had done.
Bella walked in and asked, "What are you doing with Mom?"
When the bodies of the 3 were discovered, waiting for the results of the forensic examination became a key moment in the investigation. A few days later, an analysis of the bodies of Shanann and her daughters showed that they had been strangled. In addition, signs of a struggle were found on Shanann's body, indicating that the pregnant woman was trying to defend herself. Chris Watts was immediately taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder. His confession became a key piece of evidence for the court, and preparatory hearings soon began. The news of Chris Watts' confession caused a wave of outrage and grief in society. People were shocked that a man who seemed like a kind and loving father could kill his family in cold blood. Shanann's family and friends were devastated, and Chris's parents were shocked that their son was capable of such atrocities. The public and the media actively discussed the tragedy, trying to understand how this could happen. Was he guilty? Could he have been framed? And what could have pushed Chris, at first glance a completely adequate man, to commit this brutal crime? After the confession of Chris Watts and the discovery of the bodies of his wife and daughters, the investigation came to its logical conclusion. It became clear that the case would be tried in court as one of the most brutal murders in Colorado history. The prosecution was preparing for a long trial, which was supposed to prove the cruelty of the killer and achieve a fair punishment in full. Now the case has moved to the legal plane. The defense was looking for any way to mitigate the impending sentence. The whole world watched with bated breath the events in the court, which was supposed to decide the fate of a man who became the embodiment of evil. The prosecution carefully prepared for the trial, presenting Chris Watts as a cold-blooded murderer who deliberately and brutally murdered his family. Colorado prosecutors have filed several charges against him, including 3 first-degree murders, an aborted pregnancy, and hiding bodies. Given the severity of the crimes, they insisted on the maximum punishment for the accused, which meant life imprisonment without the right to parole. On the other side was Chris Watts' defense, which tried to mitigate the punishment by any means. The lawyers focused on Chris' emotional state at the time of the crime, arguing that he was under severe psychological pressure and could not think clearly. They tried to present him as a man in crisis who had lost his way. The defense also focused on the fact that Chris committed crimes in a state of passion. He confessed to what he had done and cooperated with the investigation. They asked the court to consider these points as mitigating circumstances. However, prosecutors did not accept these arguments, believing that Chris' actions were deliberate and carefully planned. The trial began with a lot of attention from the public and the media. The courtroom was packed with journalists, and dozens of people gathered on the streets demanding fair punishment for Chris Watts. Shanann's mother, Cindy Ruzek, and her father, Frank Ruzek, were sitting in the front row, holding photos of their daughter and granddaughters. Their faces expressed endless pain and grief. The first hearings were devoted to procedural issues and examination of evidence. The prosecution presented to the court the results of a forensic medical examination, video recordings from surveillance cameras, phone call data, and text messages. The prosecution's witnesses included emotional testimony from Shanann's friends and family, who described her as a loving mother and wife, and also spoke about her fears of disappearance. She always said that her family was her life. Shanann's friend, Nicole Atkinson, told the court, "I can't believe that the man she loved and trusted could do this to her and her girls." The defense, in turn, tried to raise doubts about the premeditation of Chris' actions. They stated that the evidence gathered against him did not give a complete picture of his mental state at the time of the crime. Chris' lawyers asked the judge to allow the results of psychological examinations to be considered, which could indicate his emotional instability and stressful factors. The court hearings continued for several weeks, and every day brought new emotional shocks. Shanann's parents testified about her life and love for children, as well as their distrust of Chris, who, according to them, always seemed distant and cold. "We knew they had problems, but we never thought it could go this far," Frank Ruzek said. "We just want justice for Shanann and our granddaughters." Testimony from detectives working on the case described Chris's cold-blooded actions after the murders and his attempts to cover up the crime. They talked about how he tried to behave normally despite the terrible crime he had committed. "He didn't show any emotion even when we found the bodies," one of the detectives said. "This was a man who was desperately trying to avoid punishment." The testimony of Nicole Kessinger, the woman with whom Chris had an affair, was also heard. She talked about her relationship with him and how he hid his true intentions from her. "He told me that his marriage was over," Nicole confessed with tears in her eyes. "I never thought that he could be capable of such a thing." These statements reinforced the prosecution's case that Chris acted knowingly and with full understanding of the consequences of his actions. Prosecutors insisted that he had killed his wife and daughters in cold blood for the sake of a new life with another woman. During the closing hearings, the prosecution and the defense presented their final arguments. Prosecutors stressed that Chris Watts was motivated by selfishness and a thirst for a new life that did not include his family. They insisted on the maximum punishment for the accused, considering his actions monstrous and inexcusable. The defense, in turn, tried to commute the sentence, repeating that Chris confessed to the crime and cooperated with the investigation. They also focused on his emotional state and asked the court to take this into account when passing sentence. After several hours of consultation, the judge handed down the verdict. Chris Watts was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 5 life terms without parole. This sentence meant that he would never see freedom again. The judge also noted that Chris's crimes were horrifically cruel and the punishment should correspond to the severity of his acts. "No one has the right to take the lives of others, especially in such a cruel way," the judge said. "This verdict reflects our determination to protect the innocent and ensure justice." Chris Watts' verdict was greeted with applause and tears in the courtroom. Shanann's family finally felt some relief knowing that justice had been served, even though it would not bring their loved ones back. "We lost Shanann and the girls, and our lives will never be the same," Frank Ruzek said. "But today we got at least a small piece of justice." To date, Watts' life in prison is not inspiring at all. He leaves his cell for an hour a day to take a shower and exercise. He is allowed to have a Bible in his cell, but no more. With so much free time, Watts spends most of it reflecting on his past, says a friend of Watts. "He's sad that everyone is suffering," Chris's friend says in an interview with People magazine. "He would like to go back to the past. He would like to behave differently." A source who speaks with Watts regularly told People magazine in 2021 that Watts is being ostracized by other prisoners and guards. They avoid him and do not come into contact with him. "No one wants to have anything to do with him," the source said. "He is at the lowest social level in the entire prison. He is under protection because if he is around other prisoners, he will be in real danger. He is an outcast, even among criminals. He is probably the most hated person in this prison," the source says, "because of what he did to the children. There is a certain hierarchy in prison, and whoever harms children is at the very bottom." The Chris Watts case has become one of the most striking examples of domestic violence hidden behind the facade of well-being. The Watts family tragedy highlighted the importance of awareness of warning signs and the need to intervene in cases of suspected domestic violence. It was an immeasurable loss for the Shanann family, but they decided to use their grief to help others to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The Watts case will remain a reminder of the importance of timely intervention and support, and that we must be attentive to those who may suffer in silence.